in our time together this morning. We're going to talk a little bit about the talent crunch that everybody is aware of and experiencing, kind of where it's coming from and what's causing it. And then we're going to go into the MindWire point of view in terms of how to use PI for hiring, just sort of covering generally looking for job fit. But I realize that culture is separate from actual job fit. So we're going to then branch off into that and talk about that. And mostly today's focus is going to be how do we absorb new people into our organization and make sure that they're going to fit the culture. However, we're also going to talk about when we get to balancing teams, situations like Bill mentioned, like Lalitha mentioned, and a little bit of like Bill mentioned in the chat. How do we change the culture, right? Or how do we, assess where we are now relative to where we need to be with our teams? So we're going to spend some time on that as well. And then we're going to cover over some helpful tools. But right now, Hero, if you wouldn't mind kind of sticking in that aligning culture document. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. But if people want to, once that's in the chat, if you want to download that document, that'll be great. You can be working on that. And then when we get to it, we'll tell you how to fill it out. All right, so let's talk about the talent crunch. Finding talent today is really tricky. We've got record low unemployment rates, near a 50-year low. So my entire adult working life, it's been low. So, and a lot of yours too, right? It's just been incredibly tough to find talent in the current environment, with a couple of exceptions here and there. And you can see statistically with, almost, 1.7 to 1 openings to available candidates, that makes it very acute. On top of that, we've got about 12,000 baby boomers turning 65 daily. That's just astounding to me. That's a lot of people. And some of them are leaving. Some of them have already left. During the pandemic, a lot of my friends, I'm in the baby boomer generation, a lot of my friends said, you know what, to heck with this, we're out. And we're seeing that continuing to happen at a remarkable clip. As a matter of fact, the Department of Labor has said there are 3.5 million people missing from the labor force. And what I mean by that is 3.5 people missing that we expected to be there right now using, demographic projections from 10 years ago. And part of that is, unfortunately, we lost some people during the pandemic. We also have tightened up immigration, but 2 million of that missing labor force is baby boomers, right? Retiring way earlier than we thought they would. We knew it was going to be a big hole to fill eventually. We were kind of hoping to stave that off a little bit, but nope, it's here. The talent crunch is here now. That said, just because there's not a lot of available unemployed people doesn't mean that we're sunk. A lot of people are employed, but they're not necessarily optimally employed. They're in a job, sure, so they're not in the statistics, but they may not be doing what they want to do, especially if they're younger. So this is a ripe opportunity for us to think about the young people we want to bring into our organizations and, the traits that we want to look for in those young people. Because if you have a way of differentiating yourself at this moment from a cultural standpoint or an opportunity standpoint with these folks, and you can make yourself stand out, then, you should be able to find the people that you're looking for. And, frankly, it's always been better to hire employed people anyway. And so that's, certainly the state that we're in now. So, where we're looking for talent now, Gen X is, well over the doorstep, but they're opting to work less in the workplace. They're now part of the sandwich generation. So that happened to my generation a while back. Now Gen X is experiencing that. And, since the pandemic, people have come to expect a degree of flexibility. Work has taken a different place in our overall dynamic, right? We're starting to consider other things as being equally important. Thanks to Gen X, really, for beginning to move the needle on that, balancing work and life. Millennials, they're going to surpass the boomers in population. Older millennials have made up the skill gap, so that's good news. Younger millennials are still learning. They're still on the learning curve. So we have that issue that we need to contemplate. And Gen Z, they're in the workplace now. They're very new, very wet behind the ears. We don't know much about them and their behaviors as a generation quite yet in the workplace. But we're starting to see, they're the most digitally inclined generation ever. They've always known cell phones, right? They've always known a lot of things that Gen X and millennials witnessed growing up. So, they bring a lot to the table. Potentially, we just, they're not fully into the workplace yet. But there's been, kind of over time, there's always the older hiring managers' perception of the younger new generation, right? So back, a decade ago, it was the millennials' turn to get labeled by Gen X and the boomers, right? And it wasn't nice, some of the things that were said. Lazy, narcissistic, and entitled. Well, sure, there may be some people like that in that generation, but every younger generation is going to have some maturity to do, right? I mean, that's just normal. That's natural. One thing that kind of differentiated millennials was, hey, it's not just about the money anymore, right? We want self-actualization. We want to work somewhere where we feel like we're part of something that's bigger than ourselves, right? That's what I hear from millennials a lot. And I don't think that's all that unique, frankly. I think most of us, given a choice, would probably feel the same way. So, and certainly there's an aspect of younger folks being, more optimistic, more idealistic. They haven't kind of been worn down by the corporate world yet. And so they still have that fresh perspective, which is fine, right? Plus, every generation is the product of their times, the things that they've gone through, whether that's the Great Recession, where jobs were really, really tough, or the explosion of technology where people can now become their own entrepreneur really, really easily compared to the past. So all of those factors come into play as well. But, I just want to point out, as a baby boomer, just to be honest, that we were the first job hopping generation. So other subsequent generations are just capitalizing on that and bringing more of that kind of adaptability, flexibility, desire for self-actualization, and the incorporation of their whole lives, holistic perspective. It's just gotten more focused, right? But it certainly isn't brand new or something we've never seen before. So as a matter of fact, when we think about younger workers, we see the younger workforce being very adaptive. Obviously, they're great with tech, which is a wonderful advantage to have. They're disruptive. They're going to push back. They're not going to just accept the work day the way it has always been. Workplace was already being questioned by younger generations even before the pandemic came along, and now that's just made everybody rethink that, right? Hey, if I can be just as productive at home, why not, right? Obviously, there's some downsides to that as well. We don't have the face time we used to have as much, but we're working that out. But I think it's good. It's refreshing to get that new perspective of younger people who are going to push back. As I mentioned, younger folks are more entrepreneurial. We don't have a knowledge is power culture anymore. That used to be the case for baby boomers, but it's not true anymore. We've got people who can Google anything and figure out how to do it and watch YouTube, right? And totally nail things that you used to have to really study and memorize. That's just not the case anymore. So they're differentiating themselves in new and different ways. much more accepting and inclusive, much more connected with all that social networking that is, what they're extremely comfortable with, and doing it in an electronic way, having thousands of friends on whatever social media they're using. So much, much more connected. Passionate about social causes. So again, that young, idealistic, every generation kind of comes in that way. Looks like there's more staying power with the younger generation around these issues. Very positive mindset, so very optimistic in general. Very flexible, and finally, very health-focused. So companies that help support that healthy lifestyle, that balanced lifestyle, both emotional and physical health, folks are looking for companies like that. So if you can differentiate yourself in that way, it's all the better for you in terms of finding talent. So we're going to start by first talking about a best practice for interviewing for job fit, okay? Because that's what PI is designed for. So let's get a firm understanding of that first before we move into how to interview for culture. So if you participated in any of our webinars or classes at MindWire, you're probably pretty familiar with this pie chart, but for those who haven't seen it, let me just cover over what we're looking at here. Basically, what we're saying is that people have both fixed and variable aspects. Fortunately, PI gives us world-class tools to measure those fixed attributes. So the fixed attributes, we have a couple of different ways of measuring that. One is those behavioral attributes, the hardwiring nature of our brains that drive how we behave based on our motivating needs. We can measure that. And what we are measuring are factors, right? We're not measuring values. We're not a values instrument. We are a behavioral instrument in terms of the behavioral assessment. And the nice thing about that is brain wiring is pretty consistent, right? People's values change. Values are a learned belief system. They form the basis of a learned belief system, and they can change. Behaviors are pretty consistent. And so that's the nice thing about that, is that you really get a look into the consistency, what really makes somebody unique. We can also measure their cognitive abilities. That's another hardwired feature of people, how they learn, how quickly they learn, how much complexity, how much ambiguity do they enjoy. And that can tell you a tremendous amount about a person in terms of, how good a fit they're going to be for the job that you were hiring them for. Of course, on the other side of this chart, we have variable components. Things like skills, education, experience, knowledge, what they're doing with those fixed attributes. How have they deployed those fixed attributes throughout their career? And, we all know this, right? If you have some pretty good self-knowledge about your natural behaviors, you most likely have developed some offsetting skills, right? So if you're a certain way, you've got not a lot of patience, you may have developed some offsetting skills that help you be patient in those right moments, whether it's asking a question and then counting to 5, right? To make sure you're giving people the time they need to ask the question, whatever skills or things you're falling back on because of the self-awareness around your behavior, that's really important. And we're going to be talking a lot today about that particular aspect, those offsetting skills, because that comes into play with values as well. But what we're striving for when we use the predictive index suite of tools is we're trying to get people into roles where their behaviors and cognitive hardwiring aligns pretty well. Doesn't have to be perfect. We just want a significant amount of overlap so that person is getting to use their strengths and getting to have some of those motivating needs met. When we have a reasonable fit like that, The person gets energy from their job. They don't have to change their shape every single day to do what they do all day long. And so they have energy left over at the end of the day to put in additional effort, right? That discretionary effort where they reinvest in themselves, they invest more in the job that they're in because they enjoy it. And that's what we're striving for. They're happier, they're more engaged, right? We have an employee that we are setting up for success. So that's really what it's all about. So, you can't just predict behaviors without any knowledge of what's driving the behavior. So just to kind of refresh, what we're measuring with the behavioral assessment are people's drives, your neurological drives that create those motivating needs. So the motivating need is that itch that needs to be scratched. The scratching is the behavior. So that's what we're trying to predict. Now, a value is more of a learned thing, right? So that is something you can't really predict based on drives. Some drives may support some values and reaffirm the behaviors associated with those values. And some drives may run a little counter to a particular value, depending on the value. That we can tell, right? So there's a little bit there that we can hang our hat on, but ultimately it's all about the behaviors. Whether we are trying to fit somebody to the job and make sure we're setting them up for success relative to what the job needs for excellence, or whether we are thinking about culture, behavior is really the bottom line, right? We want someone to behave in a way that sets them up for success, both in the job and in the culture. So we have a toolbox for the job, right? And for the person, we have a behavioral assessment that can identify that hardwiring around that cognitive assessment. And then we also have the job assessment. Job assessment helps us formulate that target, right? What does the job need in terms of the 4 factors that we measure for excellence, right? What's the standard of excellence for that particular job? And it guides you, the job assessment guides you through what it should look like, right? Doesn't have to be a guessing game. The beautiful thing about PI's job assessment, though, is that we know people, even let's say it's a CFO job, we know that different companies are going to have slightly different profiles, or maybe very different profiles from one company to another around what that CFO job profile should look like. And I've experienced this with clients. I have a client that they have a lot of, they're very entrepreneurial. They've been around for a while, but they had a huge growth spurt about 5 years ago, and they were looking for a CFO. And, they had been through a couple of them. Typical CFO jobs need high formality, lots of respect for rules and structure. And, certainly things have to be done right. Your books have to be right. The numbers have to be exact, right? I mean, that's all important. But they were going through a lot of change, and they needed a CFO that was a little more comfortable with ambiguity and a little more flexible, right? So their job profile is going to look different. And it's because of the business stage that they're in, which is also the culture, right? The business stage they're in is an entrepreneurial phase. They're looking for people who are more comfortable with ambiguity. So that starts to be reflected in their job assessment. So that's one way you can make sure you bake in some of those needs that you have from a cultural standpoint into the job assessment. So let's look at interviewing for culture now. So you have the handout, and hopefully you've downloaded this, and you can see that there's a section in here for you to put your top 4 core values. Now, I know some of you may have more than 4 values, but we really want to kind of narrow down to what makes you different. Some companies have, 17 values because they have a lot of values they want to display externally. They're sending a message, like shareholders or whatever. But we really want you to think about the key ones that make a difference in terms of the internal culture you're trying to create for your teams. And we have, high A, low A, high B, low B. And the definition next to that. So dominance, extroversion, etc. What I want you to think about is just like those fixed versus variable traits. Think about, am I likely to be able to fall back on a natural tendency of this person to support the value I'm looking for? Or am I searching for a more learned response, right? Is this value not necessarily supporting the value? So I'm checking for, have they learned this value over time, right? And then what does it likely look like, or when I'm talking to the person, have I heard the value described, and what did it look like, and does that align with their hardwired behavioral nature? And we'll have some examples if you're confused by that. So we'll actually do some walkthroughs. But let's first talk about culture a little bit. Culture is driven by company values, and we're going to use MindWire's values as the example. I'm also really partial to these values. I love these values. We have joyful, smart, and relentless. We don't just say, hey, those are our 3 values. We carefully define them here, right? We want people to love what they do. We practice what we preach. We're going to set people up for success by putting them in jobs that meet their motivating needs, right? Etc. So we carefully define, what does joyful mean? What does smart mean? What does relentless mean? And, you want to make sure you've done that really well when you have company values so that people understand, what are the behaviors? What do we mean by these things, right? How do they support the culture that we're in? And what does the culture look like based on these values? Of course, there are other values that companies have. And some values are truly values, right? They're truly supporting the belief system, right, of the organization. And that belief system is the culture, right? What people believe and how people should act in the organization shapes that culture. So if you have a strong culture, you have a strong need to protect your culture. I know we at MindWire guard our culture. We're a pretty young company. We like the culture we're germinating, and we want to make sure it stays strong. So doing that on the front end, right, bringing people into the organization is extremely important. We want to make sure that we're again bringing people in who will reinforce the culture. I'm sure a lot of you guys feel the same way. But values are learned, right? They're not factors that are measured by the behavioral assessment. They're learned behaviors that can be taught over time. It does take some time, and some values are very, very strongly felt and held, but people can adapt. And as I mentioned before, some values are going to naturally align with some PI factors, and some will not. But all factors can support some values. So we're going to give you some examples. Let's first talk about how to interview from a behavioral standpoint. So those structured interviews. Fortunately, PI gives us a really great tool for that. The interview guide, where we can actually see a person's wiring, their hardwiring against the job target. And this is helpful, right? We get a visual of how well or not well the person meets our target, our job target itself, right? So we know what we're looking for. And the interview guide gives us questions to dig into where there might be some misalignment, right? So if you're doing a behavioral interview, first thing you're going to want to do is ask for a situation. Many of you have done these interviews, I'm sure, but it's, tell me about a time when you, whatever, right? Give me an exact example of a real situation. What happened? How did you handle it? Right? What were the actions that you took? What were the next steps that you took? And then what were the results? And did it turn out like you thought? Right? That's the behavioral interviewing approach. And then you want to have some good follow-up questions, right? How did that go? What were you thinking? If it didn't turn out the way you wanted to, what were the lessons that you learned? Checking for the lessons they learned is a great place to listen for value, okay? For values, right? Because they're going to say that. When they talk about the lessons they learned, they're going to pull on their values that they hold inside a lot of times. So you're going to hear it. So you're going to listen for those values. You're also going to hear values when they take action. I did this because, right? We want to explain why we took the action we did. Sometimes it's because of the natural wiring, their high dominance, so they took control. But sometimes it's a value. I felt obligated to help in this situation. Well, that might be getting to a value, right? So be sure and listen for those opportunities. These are some questions you will get as a participant in today's session. We're going to give you a handout for behavioral questions. It's sort of an encyclopedia of behavioral questions to help you think through what are some of those really good situational questions I can ask to check for value alignment. So these are kind of generic ones to help you get at that. You can also, and I recommend you do this, ask people, have they investigated your company's values, right? These young folks are all about the internet. Have they taken the time to go and look up your company website and look at the values? And if they did, what did they think, right? You can always ask that. You may not always get an honest answer, but it doesn't hurt. So let's give you a couple of examples. Here we are interviewing for a job that requires lower dominance. So we are looking for someone who loves helping others. They don't need to lead. They want to be part of a team. But our company value, as you saw earlier, one of them is relentlessness, right? So how are we going to check for relentlessness with a low dominance person? We normally associate high dominance with relentlessness, right? Because of the fact that high dominance has this natural resilience to it. Lots of self-confidence, lots of being able to, brush themselves off after failure and keep going, right? So, wow, what does relentlessness look like in a low dominance person? So you would ask, a behavioral question around low dominance. When have they served on a team rather than leading? And then, hey, how long was the project? Did that ever get tiresome, right? You're kind of checking for that resilience here. What you're likely to hear from a low dominance person around resilience or relentlessness is, I never gave up, right? I was supporting the team. It was really hard, but they were counting on me, right? They depended on me. I needed to be there and I wanted to be there. And yes, things got difficult, but we overcame challenges together, right? This is a low dominance, relentlessness response, right? Someone who never gives up on the team, doesn't get discouraged, even though they're not high dominance. It's going to look and sound different, but it's still relentlessness. Here's an example of high dominance, what you would expect, right, to be more aligned with relentlessness. You're going to ask, something around high dominance to make sure that they really are. Because just because someone's wiring indicates their high dominance, you still should check, right? You should still see if they are leaning into their strengths and they really are exhibiting high dominance. So, this is a good one, right? This might be something you ask around a outside sales position. And then you might ask a question around resilience, relentlessness. Give me an example of a time that you initially failed, right? How did you deal with it? Were you ultimately successful? And this is where you're going to get the typical responses you would expect from a high dominance person, right? I never give up. I enjoy beating the odds. The tougher it is, the more exciting it is, right? Those are the kinds of things you would expect. So here we put in our MindWire, our 3 core values. We have 3 instead of 4: joyful, smart, relentless. And so here's an example, just summarizing what we just saw, right? High dominance, that's going to be for relentlessness. That's going to align with that relentlessness, right? That high dominance, self-confidence, resilience. That's a high dominance thing, right? And this is what it's going to sound like most likely in our interview when we talk to our high dominance person. Low dominance, not necessarily naturally aligned with relentlessness. Doesn't mean they can't be, though, right? It's more of a learned behavior if they are relentless. This is what it's going to sound like. So that's how you would use that form to kind of get to, does this person align with our values? Keeping in mind the behavioral differences that you might notice. I like to interview based on the highest factor, so the factor that's furthest to the right, and the lowest factor, the factor that's furthest to the left. But I think about the highest factor always first. And that's a good one because that's going to tend to drive the answers and the behaviors that you hear in the interview. Okay? So let's keep on looking at other factors in this relentlessness and see what the other differences might be. So if you have a high extrovert that you are also interviewing and you want to check for relentlessness, you might hear something much more social, right? About persevering, finding a solution with other people, right? Instead of supporting like the low A, instead of supporting and making sure the team was successful, this is, hey, we were successful together and this person did it in an extroverted way, right? Kept talking it through. We kept working it through. We found a solution together, right? This is a high extroversion answer, what it might sound like to be relentless as a high extrovert. Here's another example, high patience, okay? So high patience kind of has a natural alignment with relentlessness in that high patience people can persevere because of their persistence, right? So there is a difference, admittedly, between persistence and relentlessness. Persistence is just kind of hanging in there, right? Just keeping at it. And high patience is super good at that. What we're looking for at MindWire is not just hanging in there, but also trying harder, trying new things, right? Trying to get around what's blocking us. So we're also testing for that. That's going to be more of a learned behavior for a high patience person. So there's a little bit of natural ability and a little bit of learned ability potentially here when we're talking to a high patience person. What you might hear from them is, I will stick with something until it's completed. Or I am persistent when I'm given something to do. Or I like to follow a process that gives me good outcomes. And when it doesn't, what you want to hear is, I change my approach so that I change my process, I change my approach until I get those good outcomes. That helps get at that resilience, that not giving up, trying new things that we're really trying to get to. And then finally, high formality and relentlessness. High formality is certainly concerned with success in a quality way, right? Very much wanting to have rules and structure and guidelines so that they could turn out a perfect deliverable, right? So what you might hear if they've made a mistake, like if you ask a question around how have you overcome failure, they're going to probably mention that they were very upset about any failures or mistakes because high formality people they're very concerned about that. They want things to be done perfectly. But you're listening for, hey, have they developed some tools? Is there some learning that has occurred over time? Those offsetting skill sets that we talked about earlier, have they adopted some of those so that they can be more resilient when mistakes happen? Because they always happen, right? Especially, in a company effort when there's many hands on deck and, not everything is in your control. So you're testing for that. What have they learned about resilience, getting past those mistakes? Let's move on to joyfulness. And I give you this example because as a low extrovert myself, I haven't always interviewed well in the past because words are not always at the tip of my tongue. And so that joyfulness that sometimes we picture in our minds, like we want that, we want happiness, we want joyfulness, we want that to be part of the equation at MindWire, it's going to look really different for your low extrovert friends, right? You're going to ask them, tell me about something that brings you joy. And they might say, I enjoy solving problems, right? And that might be all they say. And so you're going to have to use your interview skill and say, what do you enjoy about that? And tell me more about that, right? Lobies are tricky to interview. They're not just going to volunteer a bunch of information, right? They're going to answer the question you asked and be very careful about it. But are they smiling? Do you see that spark in their eye, right? When you ask them those questions about joy, that can tell you a lot. Just know that Lobies are going to give short, concise answers. They believe in verbal economy. And so they're not going to be as expressive. They can be quietly joyful. They can still have that value. It's just going to look different. Here, now I'm just going to make fun of you high Bs just a little bit. This might be how a high B expresses joyfulness, right? Lots of chatting, lots of excitement. You know, you ask about a team they were on, they're going to just talk about how great it was. And they're going to say all of these wonderful things that relate to joyfulness, right? So that's going to be easier to spot. But still, it's okay if people are low extroversion. It's okay if they're not quite this verbose. You just have to listen more carefully. Okay, we're going to talk real quickly about balancing teams. Because, you know, some of the questions we got early before we got started have to do with this. And plus, it's really important. You know, if you have really clear company values, what we don't want you to do is say, you know what, we really want a lot of action. We, want a lot. We move fast around here. So we're just only going to hire low patience people, right? Well, that would be a mistake. Sure, you may be moving fast. Some positions require the low patience, but we all need strong teams and we all need some balance, right? So I'm going to give you a different example here. This is a situation where a company wants collaborative, people-focused leadership. That is a value, okay? Company has stated that. They know how important leadership is. They really want leadership that coaches, teaches, and shares, okay? So we're going to talk about factor combinations real quickly here. This is an advanced PI concept, so I'm going to just quickly refresh on what is a factor combination. Here we have a chart of an analyzer, a profile. We can see this person's high dominance, then the A is dominance. It's to the right of the average line. Extroversion is low, B is extroversion, and in this case, it's lower than average, okay? So factor combination, always the factor that's to the right or higher is going to be stronger than the factor that's to the left. So we say A is greater than B, dominance is greater than extroversion, right? So A over B. These are the behaviors we see with dominance winning over extroversion. These are the behaviors we see with extroversion winning over low dominance, right? What the company is describing here, you could say, look, we can only hire B over A leaders. They're the only ones that are going to do this, right? You could get into that trap, but it wouldn't be advisable. Here we have a team. This is a real team at MindWire. And you can see this particular tool that's available in Predictive Index, the analytics tool. If you haven't used it yet, talk to your PI representative. They'd be happy to show it to you, but it's available to you. So you can actually see the factor combinations of the team and where people are relative to those factor combinations. We've just said we want people-oriented leadership, right? Well, most of our leaders are task-oriented. So what do? Do we just fire all the task-oriented people? Of course not. You don't want to do that. That would be extremely disruptive. However, if you are growing, and of course there's attrition, you certainly want to focus on, hey, in the future, let's bring on more B over A leadership, right? And begin to steer the ship in a different direction from a natural leadership skill standpoint. It does not mean that these people who are A over B can't learn to be a little more B over A in the right moment, right? And the more B over A other leaders you bring in, besides poor old lonely Tom over here, the more examples these A over B leaders have to see what B over A leadership looks like. What does inclusive, collaborative, people-oriented leadership look like? It's helpful to have those examples and to bring those up, but also to invest in your current leaders who may be different than what you're ultimately striving for. Another great balancing tool we have and strategic planning tool we have for teams is called design. And this is really a wonderful tool that it kind of summarizes all the different behavioral types and into 4 quadrants, okay, which makes it a little easier to see how a team is oriented. This is actually MindWire. It's a true story. When we first started, this is what we looked like. Everybody pretty much was in this upper right quadrant. Lots of great innovation and agility, right? Starting up a new enterprise, that's what you want. But after the first couple of years, we began to say, we really need some process and precision. We really need more employee experience focus. And we had key strategic goals, and these could be cultural goals too, right? You can use this tool that way as well. And that's what these purple lines are. So there's a place to fill in what your goals are, and it'll put your goals in the quadrant that they belong in, okay? And then you can see where the gaps are. So in our case, we said, whoops, we better bring on Hero, who's leading our Zoom call today, and find some people in these quadrants, or at least adjacent, close to the quadrants, so that we can support those goals. So that's another way that you can take a look at your team and begin to make some changes. If you aren't in hiring mode, you may have to borrow from some other teams for some specific projects that support these goals, and you can do that as well. All right, so ultimately, people thrive in an environment where all strengths are celebrated and appreciated. So I talked about, you don't want to just settle on a factor or a factor combination and just only hire that. We need diversity in thought to be a stronger team. And we need to recognize the strengths that all patterns and all profiles bring. So we want to celebrate those. We want to be bigger picture around those kinds of things. And as I mentioned early on, we still want to follow that careful hiring process around job fit, because people bring their best selves to work when they get their motivating needs met, right? They have more energy. They're going to pay attention more to the company culture. When people are in an environment where they're feeling like they're thriving, your culture is automatically going to be better, no matter what it is. Also, people are going to be more productive. People love playing to their strengths. That's what they do best. And you want them to do that. And you need different strengths for different functional capabilities within your organization. So you don't want to hire a bunch of clowns. You want to have a strong team. But maybe the people whose natural strengths align best with your values can be some of those champions, can illustrate the behaviors to other people in your workforce and help them learn the culture. So here's how to manage the motivating needs. This is one of the many tools. We have several management tools that help you do this, but this is the easiest. It's right at the end of the behavioral report. So you can run your behavioral report on all your employees, go to the very last part of it, and you can read what they need to be their best selves in the workplace. Managers who do this have way more success, and engagement scores are way, way higher in every organization that does it. So I recommend this as an early step to take when you're trying to change your culture, regardless of the change you're trying to achieve. And then, of course, People learn from each other. So you also have to think about guarding the gate, right? Don't let somebody in who's going to tear down the culture, because people will learn that too. You want to, if you do accidentally let somebody in like that, you're going to have to think about damage control and what's the best thing to do, given your culture around making sure that that doesn't become contagious. You want your leaders to set the right example, manage people's motivating needs regardless. Don't force your leaders, don't make your leaders think that, hey, I've got a high patience person, we have an action-oriented culture, this person's not going to work out. No, that's absolutely not true, right? Your leaders can motivate people according to how they're wired and get more out of them regardless, right? So that's what you want to teach. And then, as I mentioned before, strong teams need that diversity in the style and thinking, right? That cognitive diversity, that behavioral view is helpful to have different angles, right? Different ways of seeing the world. That just makes you stronger. So remember that behaviors associated with supporting a value are going to look different, just like the examples we walked through. And people can learn to pivot, right? I mean, even somebody who is, very cautious in a more high-risk environment, if they're given permission to fail, they can become more comfortable with risk, right? You can put other things into place in your organization that support your culture, that align with your culture, that help people fit the culture better, no matter what their wiring is. Okay, let's talk about some helpful tools you're going to have after today's session. I mentioned you're going to get this behavioral interview questions handout. It is lengthy, and it goes through the factors and the factor combinations. What to interview for if you want, like if you have low B and you want more high B, low extroversion, you want more high extroversion. This is just one example. Some things that you can ask to see if that person has those offsetting skills. And this is extremely important, right? There's a lot of low Bs who have learned to extrovert just fine. Motivating needs and insights is another one you're going to get. This also helps you get right to what are the motivating needs, right? So you can look across, if the person's high dominance, you can see what motivates them right off the bat. Same for all of the other things, right? How to connect and what the challenges will be. That way you can learn to recognize behaviors that are associated with people's wiring versus behaviors that might be associated with their values. And those are different. All right, so as I mentioned, you're going to get these slides in the recording. You're also going to get that handout that we walked through, and then the 2 additional pieces we just talked about. Okay? So now I'm going to open it up for questions.
Great. All right. So I have a couple questions queued up from the chat. And anyone else, if you have other questions or comments, please feel free to load them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. Gail, the question I want to start off with is from Carrie. She says, one question we get frequently is how to ensure a consistent and equitable interview process when we're not asking all candidates the same questions. How would you respond to that?
So I get that question a lot. That's not an uncommon question. But I want you to think about, let's talk about how you would interview for skills. Because I'm not of the belief that you have to ask everybody the exact same question. If you're interviewing for skills, you're going to look at someone's resume and you're going to see whether they have the skills or not. And maybe you asked everybody the same initial skill questions, right? Do you have 5 years experience in X? Have you been certified in Y? Blah, 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 whatever it is. But the follow-up questions have to be different, don't they? Because some people have had different training. Some people have had different experience. Some people, right? You're going to have customized questions that follow that initial question to really understand what is the skill set that they have. It's the same thing with PI. You're going to get some data instead of a resume, you're getting scientific data around the person's wiring, right? So your initial questions may be all the same, but then you're going to drill into other questions based on their actual wiring. It's very much the same as skill interviewing. It's just you got to change the mindset a little bit. And remember, you're still using facts and data to ask the questions and to formulate the questions. And it's based on what the job needs. So it's not a random, illegal question. It's all based on what the job needs. It's all job specific. It's all applicable to the work they're going to need to do. And that's all defensible when you are hiring. It's all completely legal, defensible to do. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Thanks, Gail. The other thing I'd add too is with the PI interview guide, it pulls from a bank of questions based on that job match, like Gail said. It organizes the questions by asking first questions about lack of fit, where there might be, low B and you're interviewing for high B, but then it does follow with questions confirming fit. So those same questions will be on every interview guide for each of your candidates. So there is some consistency with what's populated on that guide as well. So Carrie, let us know if you have more questions about that. Gail, the other question is just more about addressing the multiple generations in the workplace. If someone's culture is kind of struggling with balancing all the different, generational needs and styles, how might you address that, or what questions would you ask them about that?
So the culture is struggling because of the different needs of the generation.
Yeah, the culture is kind of struggling because we've got, just a wide variety of age.
Right, wide variety of age. So my question would be, why is the culture struggling? Is the culture, and I'll explain why I'm asking that, is the culture attached to a certain generation's way of doing things? That would be my first question. Is that why the culture is struggling to be able to accommodate all these different generations? So that would be question one. And because sometimes that can happen, right? We get used to the way we do things. As a baby boomer, you did not work from home. That was not okay. You worked all the time, right? Work was number one, and you put in your time, and you earned your stripes, and you didn't get to, go from this square to that square and skipping the square in between. You had to, check all the boxes on your way. The world's just not like that anymore. So if the reason that the organization is struggling is because it's attached to maybe an old paradigm, then maybe it's time to question that paradigm. But I would need to know more about why the culture is struggling to answer it appropriately.
Okay, great. Those are great follow-ups. For our question asker, if you want to add any more context in the chat or send it to me directly, we can dig into it further. And the other question that we got at the beginning is, I think we addressed it during today, but really just how do we address changing the culture on a behavioral level? So if you could summarize that.
Yep. So, change in the culture at a behavioral level happens slowly, doesn't it? People don't just automatically turn off the old behavior and pivot it. Company comes out with, hey, this is our culture now. And people have to move. They have to change. They have to, get used to and adapt to that. So it's a slow process. So it's a combination of defining where are we going and why. Why is the culture changing so that people can get their head around it? Especially your higher patience people and your high detail people, they're going to need that high formality people. They're going to need that data, right? And they're going to need to buy in. So that's a key thing. So you can begin addressing that early and often with that group. And then you can begin to right the ship, turn the ship slowly by bringing in folks that align with the new culture. As people leave, you begin to slowly replace them with folks that align with the new culture. And then also, you want to have champions that people who naturally align or who have really good offsetting skill sets that align with the new culture. You're going to want to set them up as examples. You're going to want to make sure your reward systems are in alignment with the culture that you're striving for, so that you're not giving people giant bonuses for going around the cultural expectations. I've actually seen that happen where people had a financial incentive to behave in bad ways. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure everything lines up. We're rewarding people both, financially and in other ways and in recognition and so forth for the new behavior. And that we're dealing with the people in appropriate ways that refuse to change, right? We need to, that's an effort in and of itself. You need to focus there. Make sure that your examples are louder, your good examples are louder than your bad examples.
Great. Thanks, Gail. Just one last question to kind of wrap up. For anyone on here who's struggling internally with their culture, saying, I don't think we have a very strong culture, or maybe they're lacking trust with their leadership and culture, what would be a good next step for them?
So if people don't feel like they fit the culture, and they don't trust leadership, those people are most likely going to leave. Usually people aren't able to be successful in that kind of environment. If you are in that environment and you're trying to change the environment, obviously it has to start with trust and alignment. If you don't, you've got to rebuild the trust. If that's been broken, you have to kind of get to the bottom of that. Why is there a lack of trust? What's the behavior that's causing that? Or maybe the miscommunication? Sometimes it's just a communication issue. Often I have found that to be the case. There's a lack of information flowing, all the way through the organization about why things are happening the way they are. And so communication is critical to trust. And so being a little more open, more communicative can help. And people, if you are open, communicative, the culture is strong, you have good champions, you have examples of the behavior that's required, and the person doesn't want to align with that, can't align with that, doesn't have the values that you have, they will self-select for sure. And that can be a good thing.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. That's the end of our time and the end of our questions today, conveniently. So really appreciate everyone joining on. Like Gail said, we'll be sending you the slides, the recording, and those handouts later today, if not first thing tomorrow morning. And we appreciate you so much. If you have any other questions, or if you want some one-on-one, time to look at your culture or your values against behaviors, please reach out to us or reach out to your MindWire rep. You can email us at support@mindwiregroup.com and we'll get you connected.
Thanks, everyone.